Imagine this. A black man moves into a quiet neighborhood, only to be met with a racist neighbor who calls the cops on him. But there's a twist. He's not just any man. He's the new chief of police. Watch how justice gets served in the most unexpected way. You won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned. The street was quiet, lined with well-manicured lawns, clean sidewalks, and houses that all looked nearly identical. It was the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on uniformity, where the residents had an unspoken agreement to keep things exactly the way they were. Change wasn't welcome here, and then Malcolm moved in. It was early morning when the moving truck pulled up to the house next door to Henry. A few workers jumped out, unloading boxes, carrying furniture, carefully placing things in the driveway before moving them inside. Henry had been watching from his front porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, eyes narrowed. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed surprises, and this, his new neighbor, was definitely not what he had expected. Then Malcolm stepped out of his car. Tall, well-built, dressed in a crisp black t-shirt and fitted jeans. He walked with the kind of confidence that made people take notice. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the mostly white neighborhood, and Henry felt an immediate, irrational hatred bubbling up inside him. He hated him before even knowing his name. Henry took another sip of his coffee, shaking his head. Just what this neighborhood needed, he muttered under his breath. Over the next few days, he made sure Malcolm knew he wasn't welcome. At first it was the stares. Long, judgmental glares whenever Malcolm walked past his house. Then the casual comments. "You people sure do love blasting music, don't you?" He had muttered one afternoon when Malcolm was sitting on his porch, enjoying a quiet moment. Malcolm had simply glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't even playing music." Henry shrugged, just saying, "Keep it that way." Malcolm didn't engage. He had been in situations like this before, dealing with men like Henry, men who didn't even bother to hide their bigotry. Another day, Malcolm was in his driveway unloading groceries from his car when Henry walked by and scoffed. Didn't know they accepted food stamps at that store. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He could feel the heat of anger rising, but forced himself to breathe through it. "Not everyone lives off handouts," he replied, placing the bags down before walking inside, without another word. But Henry didn't stop. One morning, Francis was leaving for a run when he noticed something off about his trash bin. He walked over, lifted the lid, and saw that someone had dumped a pile of rotting food and garbage inside. At first he thought maybe it was a mistake, until he looked up and saw Henry standing across the street smirking. "Something wrong with your trash, buddy?" Henry called out, feigning innocence. Malcolm stared at him, then shook his head and went on his run. The pettiness escalated. A few days later he found scratch marks along the side of his car. Another morning he stepped out to find his lawn littered with eggshells and toilet paper. He knew exactly who was responsible, but confronting Henry would only give him the reaction he wanted, so Malcolm let it slide, until the day things went too far. It was a warm afternoon when Malcolm rode into the neighborhood on his brand-new motorcycle. It was a beauty. Sleek, powerful, deep metallic blue with polished chrome accents. The kind of bike that turned heads. The kind that Henry never imagined a black man could afford. Malcolm pulled into his driveway, took off his helmet, and admired his new purchase for a moment. But before he could even put the kickstand down, Henry was already stomping across his yard. "You've got to be kidding me." Henry spat. Malcolm sighed. "What now?" Henry pointed at the bike. "Don't tell me you actually bought this with your own money." Malcolm frowned, trying to hold back his irritation. "What are you implying?" Henry folded his arms. "I think you know damn well what I'm implying." Malcolm let out a dry chuckle. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" "I'm just saying," Stewart continued, circling the bike like a vulture. "This is a pretty expensive machine for someone like you. Looks like something that might have been, I don't know, stolen." Malcolm felt his blood boil. He had dealt with racism all his life, but something about this moment, about this man standing there so confident in his hate, made him snap. "You racist scum," Malcolm said, stepping off his bike and facing Henry. "Not everyone is like you." Henry grinned, enjoying the reaction. "Just admit it. Or better yet, I'll call the cops and let them figure it out." Malcolm scoffed, shaking his head. You're such a psycho. Go ahead, call them. That was it. That was the final straw for Henry. His face twisted with rage, his hands curling into fists. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? He growled. Before Malcolm could react, Henry swung. A hard punch landed right on Malcolm's jaw, snapping his head to the side. The taste of iron filled his mouth as he staggered back a step, blinking in shock. Henry stood over him, chest heaving. Take that, you black moron. He spat. And now I'm calling the cops. Malcolm wiped his lip and let out a slow, humorless chuckle. He looked up at Henry, a strange glint in his eyes. You're going to regret this, he murmured. Henry ignored him, already dialing 911. Yeah, I need an officer at my location immediately. I've been attacked by a violent suspect. Looks like he stole a motorcycle, too. He hung up and smirked. Let's see how tough you are when they haul your ass away. Malcolm just stood there watching him. A few minutes later, the sound of a patrol car pulling up filled the air. Officer Carter stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. Henry immediately pointed at Malcolm. That's him. He attacked me. And I think he stole that bike, too. Carter frowned and turned to Malcolm, and then he froze. His eyes widened as recognition dawned, and his entire demeanor shifted. Sir, Carter said, blinking in disbelief. It's you. Malcolm wiped his mouth, his expression unreadable. Good to see you, Officer Carter. Henry, still fuming, stared between them. What the hell is going on? Carter slowly turned to face him, his expression unreadable. You really don't know, do you? Know what? Carter took a deep breath, shaking his head. You just assaulted our new chief of police. Silence. The color drained from Henry's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Malcolm, then at Carter, then back again. No, he muttered. Oh yes, Carter said. And from the looks of it, you're completely screwed. Malcolm took a step forward, standing over Henry. Now tell me, Henry, what should I do with you? Henry's legs wobbled. He felt his stomach sink, as if the earth beneath him had vanished. His lips quivered, his mind raced, and yet he found himself unable to form a single word. His entire body betrayed him, refusing to move, refusing to process what he had just heard. Malcolm wiped the blood from his lip, his expression unreadable. He could see the fear settling into Henry's eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with physical harm, but everything to do with power. The very thing Henry believed should never belong to a black man. Henry blinked rapidly, shaking his head. No, there's no way. This has to be a joke. Carter's face remained serious. It's not a joke, Henry. You just assaulted the highest-ranking officer in the city. Malcolm crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. So tell me, Henry, what do you think happens now? Henry's breathing became erratic. He tried to think, tried to reason with himself. Maybe if he denied it, if he played dumb, this could all go away. This is some kind of mistake, he stammered. I didn't know. If I had known. Malcolm took a step closer, his presence looming over Henry like a storm cloud. Oh, so if you knew I was the chief, you wouldn't have punched me? You wouldn't have accused me of stealing my own bike? He let out a dry chuckle. That's interesting. Carter shook his head, watching the entire scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had seen plenty of people like Henry in his years on the force, men who felt entitled, men who thought the world revolved around their outdated beliefs. But this was poetic justice. I was angry. Henry tried to explain, his voice trembling. I didn't think. No. Malcolm interrupted, his tone calm but firm. You thought exactly how you always think. You saw a black man with something nice, and you couldn't accept it. So you did what you always do. You assumed. You insulted. You attacked. He let the words sink in, watching as Henry squirmed under their weight. I swear I didn't mean. Malcolm held up a hand. Don't stand here and lie to me, Henry. He exhaled, shaking his head. This is about more than me. This is about every person you've looked down on. Every black man you've judged before you even knew their name. He pointed at Henry's trembling hands. Look at you. You're scared. But why? Because suddenly, the power isn't in your hands anymore. Henry's throat felt dry. He wanted to scream, to disappear, To wake up and find out this was all some horrible dream. But it wasn't. Francis turned to Carter. "Officer, what's the charge for filing a false police report?" Carter's eyes flickered to Henry. "It's a criminal offense." "And what about physical assault?" Carter sighed. "Also a criminal offense." Henry gasped, his hands shooting up in surrender. Wait, please. I wasn't thinking. I'll apologize. I'll make it right." Malcolm took a deep breath, looking at him with something far more powerful than anger, disappointment. "You're not sorry, Henry," he said quietly. "You're just afraid of the consequences." Silence stretched between them. The weight of the truth pressed down, heavy and undeniable. For the first time in his life, Henry felt small, and for the first time he understood what it meant to be powerless. Henry stood frozen in place, his body tense, his mind racing. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he was always in the right, that people like. Malcolm didn't belong in his world, but now he was looking at the man he had just punched, the man he had mocked, insulted, and belittled, only to realize that this wasn't just some random black guy from the neighborhood. This was the chief of police. Malcolm didn't break eye contact. His expression wasn't angry, nor was it gloating. It was calm, composed, almost eerily so. And that made it even worse for Henry. The silence between them was suffocating. Henry swallowed hard. "Look, I didn't know, okay?" His voice came out shaky, desperate. "If I had known who you were, I wouldn't have." Malcolm let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "If you had known." He took a step closer, his presence alone making Henry instinctively step back. "So what you're saying is, if I were just some ordinary black man in this neighborhood, you'd have no problem doing what you just did?" Henry opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Malcolm shook his head. "See, that's the problem with people like you. You don't hate what you did. You just hate that you got caught." Carter, the responding officer, stood quietly, watching the exchange with a mix of unease and morbid fascination. He had seen plenty of racists in his time, but he had never seen one dig himself into a hole this deep. Stewart's breathing grew heavier. "I swear, it was a mistake," he muttered, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out of this mess. I got angry. You thought I stole my own bike." Malcolm finished for him. "Because in your mind a black man with something nice must have taken it from someone else. Isn't that right?" "I didn't mean it like that," Henry stammered. "Oh, you meant it exactly like that," Malcolm countered. "And now, for the first time in your life, you're feeling what it's like to be judged unfairly, to have someone look at you and decide in an instant that you're guilty. Feels different when the shoe's on the other foot, doesn't it?" Henry's mouth went dry. He was panicking now, his thoughts spinning wildly. "Look, Chief, sir," his voice cracked as he tried to salvage the situation. "Please, I have a family. I have a job. If I get arrested—" "Oh, so now you care about consequences?" Malcolm interrupted. His tone remained steady, but his words carried a weight that pressed down on Henry's chest like a boulder. "You didn't think about that when you called the cops on me, did you? When you lied and told them I attacked you?" Henry lowered his gaze, unable to meet Malcolm's piercing stare. Carter cleared his throat. "Sir, if you'd like to press charges, I can take him in right now." Henry's head snapped up. His eyes went wide with fear. "No, please, I swear I'll change. Just don't do this." Malcolm studied him for a long moment. He could see the terror in Henry's face, the raw desperation in his eyes. He wasn't sure if it was true regret or just fear of punishment, but either way it was a start. "I could have you arrested," Malcolm said finally. "I could make sure you faced the exact kind of treatment you were hoping I'd get when you called the police on me. But I won't." Henry blinked in shock. You won't." Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. Because unlike you, I don't believe in using power to punish people just because I can." Henry's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, sir. I swear I'll never." "But," Malcolm cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade, "I'm not letting you walk away from this without learning something." Henry stiffened, bracing himself. "You want to prove to me that you'll change?" Malcolm asked. "Then prove it. I'm putting you in a mandatory anti-racism program." Henry frowned. "What?" You heard me, Malcolm said. You'll be attending weekly sessions. You'll listen to people talk about what it's like to be treated the way you just treated me. You'll understand what your words and actions do to people. And you won't just sit there. You'll actually participate. Stuart's face twisted in discomfort. That's not really necessary. It is, Malcolm said firmly. And if you refuse, I'll have Carter here process you for assault and filing a false police report. Your choice. Carter nodded. He's got you there, Henry. Henry's fists clenched at his sides. Every part of him wanted to resist, to argue, to fight back. But what could he do? The power he once had was gone, and for the first time, he was being held accountable. His voice was low, resentful. Fine. Not good enough, resentful. Fine. Not good enough, Malcolm said. I want to hear you say it properly. Henry swallowed his pride. His throat felt tight. His stomach churned. But he had no choice. I'll do it, he muttered. Malcolm narrowed his eyes. Louder. Henry hesitated. Then, gritting his teeth, he said, I'll do it. Malcolm gave a small nod. Good. Now you're going to apologize. Not just for today, but for every time you've treated someone like me as less than human. Henry's jaw clenched. This was harder than any punishment he could have imagined. He forced himself to look Malcolm in the eye. I'm sorry. Harder than any punishment he could have imagined. He forced himself to look Malcolm in the eye. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch. Let Henry feel the weight of what he had just done. Apology accepted, he said finally. But words mean nothing without action. You'll prove to me and to yourself that you can be better. Henry nodded, shame washing over him. He had spent years believing he was superior, that people like Malcolm were beneath him. Now he wasn't sure if he had ever been more wrong about anything in his life. Malcolm turned to Carter. That'll be all, officer. Thank you for your time. Carter gave a respectful nod. Of course, Chief. Welcome to the city. As Carter walked back to his patrol car, Malcolm glanced at Henry one last time. Today could have gone a lot differently, he said. You're lucky I believe in second chances. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Henry standing there, changed, shaken, and for the first time truly questioning everything he thought he knew. Henry stood there long after Malcolm had left, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him harder than anything he had ever experienced. The man he had insulted, punched, and falsely accused had just walked away, offering him a second chance instead of the punishment he probably deserved. For the first time in his life, Henry felt something deeper than just embarrassment. He felt shame. He spent the rest of that day in a daze, barely able to function. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup in the morning, and his reflection in the bathroom mirror felt like that of a stranger. Who was he? Was he really the kind of man who judged people based on their skin? Who felt anger seeing someone like Malcolm succeed? He had always convinced himself that he wasn't a real racist, just someone who said things that weren't meant to be taken that way. But now, stripped of his pride, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. The next week was brutal. Henry showed up at the first anti-racism workshop Malcolm had assigned him to. He had expected to just sit in the back, nod a few times, and leave. But from the moment he stepped inside, he realized this wasn't going to be easy. The room was filled with people from different backgrounds. Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous. People who had faced discrimination their entire lives. People who had stories. Real stories. An older black man named Thomas was the first to speak. His voice was calm but heavy with emotion. When I was your age, Henry, I got arrested for no reason, Thomas said, looking straight at him. Cops pulled me over, said my car looked stolen. They threw me against the hood, cuffed me so tight my wrists bled, and held me in a cell for 24 hours before letting me go. No charges, no apology. Just told me I was free to go. He leaned forward. You ever been arrested for nothing, Henry? Henry felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to argue, to say, not all cops, but the words didn't come. Another woman, Maria, spoke next. You ever walked into a store and had security follow you around? She asked. Ever had someone clutch their purse when you walked by? Ever had people assume you only got something nice because you stole it? Henry's heart pounded in his chest. Imagine living your whole life like that, Maria continued. Imagine your entire existence being questioned, being doubted, being feared. And now tell me again that what you did to Malcolm wasn't racist. Henry had no response. For the first time he was forced to listen, to really listen, and the more he heard, the more he realized how deep his ignorance ran. Over the next few weeks, something inside him started to shift. He read books on systemic racism, watched documentaries on Black history, and sat through hours of uncomfortable but necessary discussions. He learned about redlining, police brutality, microaggressions, terms he had dismissed before as political nonsense. Now they felt real. And every time he learned something new, he thought of Malcolm. One day he found himself standing outside the police station, heart hammering in his chest. He stepped inside and asked for Malcolm. One day he found himself standing outside the police station, heart hammering in his chest. He stepped inside and asked for Malcolm. When the chief finally appeared, he looked genuinely surprised to see Henry there. "Didn't expect to see you here," Malcolm said, crossing his arms. "Everything all right?" Henry took a deep breath. I wanted to thank you." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not throwing me in jail that day," Stewart admitted. "For giving me a second chance instead of the punishment I probably deserved." Malcolm studied him for a moment. "And," Stewart exhaled, "and you were right. About everything." He hesitated before continuing. "I used to think I wasn't racist because I never wore a white hood or burned crosses or did any of the obvious stuff. But racism isn't just that, is it? It's the little things, too. The assumptions, the words, the way you look at people." Malcolm nodded. "Took you long enough to figure that out?" Henry let out a short laugh, though it was mostly just nervous energy. "Yeah, guess I was a slow learner." Malcolm gave him a long, unreadable look. "And now?" Henry shrugged. "Now, I'm trying. I'm not saying I'm perfect. Hell, I probably still have a long way to go. But I want to be better." Malcolm tilted his head, considering his words. Then, to Henry's surprise, he extended his hand. Henry hesitated for only a moment before shaking it. "I'll be watching you," Malcolm said. "If this is just a performance, I'll know." "It's not," Henry said, and for the first time in a long time he truly meant it. Months passed and Stewart's transformation continued. He started volunteering at community events, working with underprivileged kids, even attending town hall meetings where discussions on race and policing took place. The more he learned, the more he realized how blind he had been for so long. And through it all, his relationship with Malcolm slowly changed. It started with small conversations, casual talks at the grocery store, a nod of acknowledgement at the local coffee shop. Over time, those brief moments turned into full discussions, and before either of them realized it, a genuine friendship had formed. One evening, Henry invited Malcolm over for a barbecue. As they sat in the backyard, beers in hand, Henry shook his head. "You know, if you had told me a year ago that we'd be sitting here like this, I would have called you crazy." Malcolm smirked. "Yeah, well, if you had told me a year ago that a racist like you could actually change, I would have called you crazy too." Henry laughed, shaking his head. "Fair enough." The night continued, filled with laughter, shared stories, and an understanding that had taken time to build. By the end of it, Henry turned to Malcolm with a serious expression. "I know I can't erase what I did, and I know that not everyone will forgive me for the kind of person I used to be. But I just want you to know, I'm grateful. You didn't have to give me a second chance, but you did, and that changed my life." Malcolm took a sip of his beer, nodding slowly. "Good. Then make sure you keep proving me right." Henry smiled, and for the first time in his life, he knew he would. As the months turned into years, Henry's transformation became more than just words. It became action. He didn't just change his mindset. He changed his life. He became an advocate for racial equality in his community, speaking out against the very biases he once held. Malcolm, now fully settled into his role as chief of police, watched Henry's journey with quiet pride. He had seen many men in his life claim they would change, but few actually followed through. Henry was different. He had faced his own demons, admitted his mistakes, and actively worked to become better. Their friendship, once unthinkable, became a symbol of something bigger than both of them. Proof that people could change, that ignorance could be unlearned, and that sometimes justice wasn't about punishment, but about redemption. One afternoon years after that fateful day, Henry and Malcolm sat on a park bench watching kids play in the distance. You ever think about what would have happened if things went differently that day? Henry asked. Malcolm smirked. Yeah, you'd probably still be an angry old racist, and I'd probably be pressing charges. Henry chuckled. Yeah, guess I got lucky. Malcolm shook his head. Nah, luck had nothing to do with it. You made a choice. That's what matters. Henry nodded, letting the words settle in. He had made a choice. A choice to be better. To grow. Henry nodded, letting the words settle in. He had made a choice. A choice to be better. To grow. To let go of the hate that had once defined him. And in the end, that choice had changed everything.